In this lecture, we're going to cover another way of processing a form in Angular with the reactive model form. And by the end of this lecture, you're going to know how to use the form control directive. You're going to know how to subscribe to a form group or a form control observable. And you're going to learn how to use the debounce time and distinct until changed RxJS operators. So to begin with, we're going to set up our form. And both form controls and form groups expose an observable called values changed. And by subscribing to this observable, we can react in real time to changing values of an individual form control or a group of form controls via a form group. So one such use case could be implementing a search field in an application. As the user types into the search field, we may want to call an API. But since calling an API is a relatively expensive operation, we want to limit the number of API calls to only when absolutely necessary. So our component might have a template that looks like this. We have a very simple input control with a type of search and just a placeholder saying please enter search term. And underneath that, we just want to render out a list of the individual search terms the user has searched for. Now in our component, we have a search field, which is just the form control itself. And we have an array of searches, which just holds an array of strings and which we've initialized to the empty array. Now as we perform searches, I want to push onto this searches array. And as we push onto the searches array, we're going to render out individual search terms in a list under our input control. So previously I showed you how to link individual template form controls to a model form via the form control name directive. Now that only worked when we had a top level form group. Right now we don't have a top level form group. All we have in our component is a form control. So to link a form control instance on our component to an input control in our template, we use the form control directive. Now, very clearly, we're using the form control directive and not the form control name directive. So to use the form control directive, we just type form control and we wrap it in square brackets because we want to pass a value into it. And the value we want to pass into it is the name of our form control field, which is search field. So just by doing this, we've linked this input control to this field on our form component. Okay, that's not very useful on its own. We need to react to changes in our form. And to do that, we subscribe to the value changes observable on our search field. So the value changes property on our search field is an observable. And what do we do with observables? We subscribe to them. So I'm going to call .subscribe. I then pass a callback function. And in the callback function, it's going to pass the term that the user has entered into the input field. And I'm just pushing that onto our searches array. And then this should automatically be rendered out in our list field here. Before I run this, I just made a quick error. So it should be value changes, not values changes. And now if I run our application, then as I type into the search field, you can see the results are automatically getting pushed onto the searches array, and that's getting rendered out in the list control in our view on the right-hand side. So we can actually see right now that a search term is being printed for every single key press. So if I had linked this up to an API call, then for every single key press, we're making an API call, probably an unnecessary API call. Ideally, we want to only make a request, an API request, when the user has stopped typing. And this is such a common use case that with RxJS, there is an operator that we can use called debounce time. So I'm going to add this operator to our observable chain. And debounce time takes as a first parameter a number of milliseconds. It will then only publish to its output stream if there has been no more input for that number of milliseconds on its input stream. Now, just as a reminder, to use any of the operators from RxJS, we need to make sure we import them at the top. I've imported all the operators by importing RxJS/Rx, but you may wish to just import the individual debounce time operator if you're trying to reduce file size. Or I recommend that you do that before you release your application anyway. So now if I rerun the application, you can see it's not printing the intermediate values as I'm typing away, and only once it's detected that I've paused typing for 400 milliseconds does it actually print something out. So if I now typed, you can see it's only printing Asim's call at the end. Well, in fact, I think 400 milliseconds is a bit too short. Let's change that to 800 milliseconds and see how it behaves then. There you go. Now we can see it's only printing, it's only adding to the list if the user has stopped typing for 800 milliseconds. If this was connected to an API, then we would only be sending in one API request instead of one for every character the user typed into the input field. But essentially typing in the same characters into the search control, we get fewer search terms printed to the screen. But looking at the list, we can see we've got foo2 printed twice in a row. Now this would trigger a second unnecessary API request for the same search term. So you would have searched for foo2, I added foo2, then I deleted it, then I added 2 again, then that did another search for foo2. Now because I've already done a search for foo2, there's no need to do a second search for foo2. So ideally we only want to make the API call if the search term hasn't changed. And like before, there is an operator with RxJS we can use called distinct until changed, which only publishes to its output stream if the value being published is different from before. So to use it, we simply add it to our observable change. I'm going to add it after the debounce time operator. And now if I rerun the application and I type in the same characters in the same sequence as before, you can see we get even fewer search terms printed to the screen. Specifically, we only get foo2 printed once, saving us another API call. So in summary, we can process a model-driven form the traditional way by calling a function on submission of the form and then processing the form action in that function. But with Angular, we also have another option of processing the form by means of an observable chain, which we can then subscribe to. And by using reactive forms and some RxJS operators, we can implement powerful functionality in just a few lines of code. Now, one solution is not better than the other. Reactive forms are better when there needs to be some real-time processing of the form as the user types in content, and handling model-driven forms with submit handlers is better when there needs to be some discrete action applied when the user presses a button. And they are not mutually exclusive. You can perform some form processing on the submit function and some processing by subscribing to the observable. This brings to a conclusion the model-driven method of creating and handling forms in Angular. In the next lecture, we will refactor our model-driven form into a template-driven one instead.